So, today I'm going to be sharing my research on, well, my ongoing research on DNA testing and my growing research on other consumer-focused healthcare technologies. Uh, and this builds on, well, this is based on several pieces of work. So there's my book, which deals with regulation of the personal genomics industry. I'm still doing a lot of work in that space. I have two funded projects, one with Dr. Jan Charbonneau at the University of Tasmania, where we're running a public survey in Australia and New Zealand. And we hope to be able to share data from that later this year or next year. And I also have a second project funded by the Boren Foundation in New Zealand with Professor Samuel Better, who's based at the University of Victoria in Wellington, New Zealand. And that's looking at consumer risks in the context of personal genomics. So we'll be hoping to share information on that later in the year and next year. But I'm very grateful to my previous university, the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and Genomics Aotearoa for my funded research. But my book follows on from my doctorate, which looked at regulation of the personal genomics industry. I'm hoping to be publishing a companion volume in the next few years, which will delve into that a little bit more and some other different technologies. And then the other piece of work that this is based on today is a chapter that I wrote, which deals with secondary use of data from the personal genomics industry and from wearable tech. So I'm going to start by talking about DNA testing, and this really is an introduction to my work. I really would love it if you read some of my work, or if you've already read it. I'm very happy to be contacted, and I'm very open to collaboration in this space. So I've been looking at this industry for quite a long time now, more than 10 years. I actually first became aware of it in the context of my master's studies, actually, so I've known about it for quite a while. And from 2011 to the present, I've actually been compiling data about the industry. And whenever I'm interested in something, I tend to be way too interested in it. And on the next slide, you'll see that I've actually shared some of my data publicly. So this is essentially a list of all the companies I could find that offered some form of DNA testing with an English language website. And as you'll see on the next slide, I'm planning to update it, but due to the impacts of COVID and lockdowns on my life, it'll probably be later this year rather than before. So in my book, I've detailed the rise of this particular industry, and it also draws upon a review of 71 contracts that I've actually compared from companies that market tests for health purposes. So one of the things I'm going to go through with you today is just to encourage you to think about the industry as a spectrum, though. It's very diverse. We tend to know of about a few prominent companies in this space, and I'll go through those in a moment. But just in case it's useful for anyone, my book is actually available for free through JSTOR, so that's really helpful, and it's really good for if you need to refer any students to it. So that's enough of a plug for that, but I really hope that my work is useful, and I've spent a lot of time trying to contribute to giving more information to the public about risks and limitations in this space. So this is just a link to my data set if you want to play around with any of my data and see the types of tests that companies offer and where they're based. I believe in open access, which is why it's been posted on Zenodo for a couple of years now. There's a few versions, but there will be another version in the near future. So, and just to highlight, this is a quote from my book chapter as well. This just draws upon the two examples of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry, aka personal genomics, and wearable fitness and health monitoring devices, and how they're used for secondary purposes. So, and just to highlight a couple of news items here, the personal genomics industry has created a market for DNA tests as consumer and commercial services. So it's brought them out of a clinical setting and into people's homes. They're much cheaper than they used to be. And in the last few years, we've seen a real increase in uptake by the general public, which means that these services are available to a much wider range of people, some of whom may be vulnerable in some way or vulnerable consumer groups. And one thing just to be aware of in this space is that I have seen a number of companies marketing tests specifically for First Nations, particularly Native American ancestry. And I would always urge caution around these things, because even the largest databases don't have very good sample sizes of those populations. And for many people who have mixed heritage, like myself actually, you may find limited utility from these. But it's meant that there's the great potential through these services for people to be connected with unknown relatives. And then at the same time, law enforcement is becoming much more interested in trying to access these services. And you'll see that from a slightly different perspective, wearable technology devices are starting to be used in the court as evidence, both against suspects and also in support of victims. But we do need to take a cautious approach to this, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So, and I will stop myself. I'm waiting for the doom bell, the doomsday bell, but we'll see. So I'm hoping most of you are familiar with these larger companies now. If I'd given this talk even 8 years ago, far less people, even in computer science departments, would necessarily have heard of these types of companies. But 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA are fairly well known today, and some of you who are interested in genetics might be aware of Decode Genetics as well. And they were interesting because they were originally the company that got the contract to map the genome of the Icelandic population, but that was done on an automatic opt-in basis, and that was quite controversial. And they've had several lives where they, at one time, they were a personal genomics company as well. And then we have 23andMe, which is one of the market leaders. It was co-founded by Anne Wojcicki, who used to be married to the co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin. Google has invested heavily in this company, but also the company has now been acquired by Virgin. So when we think about privacy issues in this space and there's potential for data sharing and secondary use, it really is quite a challenging area. And likewise, Ancestry actually started out as a genealogy website. I actually used that for some family history research. Some of you may have used that as well for a while. I personally have not had a DNA test with any of these companies because I've been looking at the industry for such a long time, and I'm a bit of a skeptic and I'm cautious. I would have a genetic test in a healthcare setting if I had a serious health concern. But Ancestry has really become very popular for its DNA tests, but it's also been taken over by another investment company. And then some of you may have heard of Family Tree DNA, which is owned by Gene, which is based in Texas. And they have actually been buying up smaller ancestry testing companies. So their database is quite large. So all of these three are pretty significant databases of consumers now in the millions. And MyHeritage is another one that you might be aware of that has quite a significant database as well. And what I'm going to show you in the next few seconds or minutes is a few screenshots just to give you some idea of the nature of the industry and some of the challenges it raises. So the main thing I'd like you just to be aware of here is it really is a spectrum. It ranges from quite well-known health tests and ancestry tests at the popular end of that spectrum, and I would say the more responsible end of the spectrum, even though we might still be cautious and have concerns about some of the things the companies are doing. But at the other end, you have things like peace of mind paternity tests, which are often offered without witnesses, and Then there's also surreptitious testing and child talent and even matchmaking. All of those I would be very cautious about, and I would generally discourage people from using them unless they really have thought about it very seriously, but particularly the surreptitious test and the child talent tests. They're really quite worrying, and I'm going to give you a taste of what's out there in the next few slides. But also, I'd just like to highlight with the spectrum and the fact that there are some tests that are quite concerning. We do really need better oversight of the industry. We have several areas of law that are applicable to the industry, so data protection and privacy, consumer protection, contract, even medical device legislation has been used in some contexts. But we do need better enforcement of that law in this context, and we need improvement. And I will end this talk with some suggestions for reform. I don't think there's one perfect solution at the moment, but I hope that my suggestions will contribute to improving things for consumers. So before I show you the range of tests that are out there, I wanted just to stress a couple of points about the nature of genetic information. So all of us have DNA, and we can leave it anywhere we go. I mean, at the moment I'm working from home and I'm not really going many places because Omicron is still running rife in New Zealand. But ordinarily, when I'm in a university context and when things were more normal, I and other people will potentially leave traces of ourselves everywhere we go. But when we actually have a genetic test, that generates digital data and our genetic code. And that digital data can be stored potentially indefinitely if it's stored correctly. And it can be used also to identify family members because we share a lot of our DNA with our family. And unfortunately, that also means that although your genetic code can be used as a unique identifier for you, it can also be used, particularly by law enforcement and other entities who are interested in this, to identify quite large family groups. So particularly for vulnerable communities, especially Indigenous peoples, but other historically marginalised groups, it's quite problematic to have this data in a private company system if we don't have good oversight. So the other thing just to be aware of here is that for quite a while there used to be quite a lot of interest in anonymization techniques of genetic data. And we can do some things that will minimize the potential for re-identification with encryption and other similar technologies. But there's been a number of studies that have shown that it's quite possible to re-identify individuals in very large databases if you have the right skill set with actually access to very limited information about them. And so it's quite possible that having a data leak in this context could be problematic for quite a long time, and the risk of a data leak because of the shared nature of DNA isn't necessarily going to decrease over time. It just might cause problems for your family, even if you're not here anymore. And so just bearing in mind that aspect too, that it is a unique identifier for you and we can't change it, because once we have your genetic sequence, it's not going to change in a way that would mean we couldn't link it back to you. So that's quite different to your bank PIN number, which you can change, but there are other examples that we could perhaps make comparisons with. So for instance, in the US, where you have social security numbers, they are very difficult to change. It is possible to change them, but it's very difficult. And in data breach cases like the Equifax one, some people who had their social security numbers released together with some other information could potentially have people taking out credit cards in their names for a very long time. So if we begin in the future to use genetic data as we're using other biometrics in security systems, I'm not saying we are at the moment, but there is the potential in terms of future risk here, that if something goes wrong, it could go quite badly wrong because you can't really change that. So that's just something to bear in mind. I'm not trying to be depressing, but it's just, I do think quite a lot about future risk in my work. So just to give you a few examples, so I'm based in New Zealand at the moment, so sometimes I'm accessing a New Zealand version of the site, but I'm just giving you a range of screenshots to show the type of content that people will encounter and the fact that generally companies will encourage people to buy multiple tests, sometimes as gifts. They have different sales for particular holidays, and often the website content will really give a person a sense in the context of health tests that the information they're getting could be useful for treatment. There's actually been a number of studies which show limitations on that, and it is something that we need to be quite cautious about, because while some tests for specific monogenetic conditions such as Huntington's disease, we have quite a gold standard sort of test, and it's quite strongly inherited. For many complex diseases, the tests aren't harmonized, so companies and researchers are looking at different genetic variants and their association with the same disease. So we've had examples in various studies of people getting contradictory test results from different companies for the same condition, which begs the question, particularly for consumer lawyers, what is the nature of the benefit that the consumer is getting? And then we also, because we're starting to see carrier testing being offered and pharmacogenetic testing, we're also seeing some nutrigenetic testing, and this is one example of that. Often this has more in common with some of the sort of dieting companies, and while there might be some value to some of this, a lot of what's on offer at the moment is a very genetically deterministic view of your health, and many geneticists would look at other factors in relation to whether someone is going to develop particular diseases or conditions, particularly your environment and how you live. So if you're interested in this and you haven't looked at it previously, this is a link to a study which actually looked at the level of clinical utility of some of 23andMe's BRCA testing. And BRCA variants, some of you may know, are particularly associated with breast and ovarian cancer, but you'll see in the study that they found that 23andMe tests for quite a small proportion of the known variants, and so the test results might be of quite limited value to many consumers, and the study's authors encourage people to have follow-up testing for both positive and negative findings. So for me, that's always meaning that if we think about these tests for health purposes being offered commercially, it is quite problematic if what the consumer is getting might not be that useful to them. So now on to the slightly more common and popular and more fun ancestry testing. I'm quite interested in family history, but just to be aware that these tests are also not standardized, so you can get different ethnicity estimates from different companies, and ethnicity, as we all know, is a bit of a construct, and sometimes people can find out things that are quite different from what they expected. And you'll see that they also have holiday discounts. I saved this particular screenshot from when I was living in Ireland. This was a discount in honor of the Soccer World Cup. I'm not really sure why that would make you want to get an ancestry DNA test, but it's just one example. And then there's a couple of other examples here just to give you some idea of what's out there as well. This is a very recent one from MyHeritage. And just to give you the other side of this, if you are interested in some of the problems around this, particularly if you're interested in Indigenous peoples, I would recommend having a look at this article, which talks about a particular company in Canada generally providing 20% First Nations ancestry estimates for many different people, regardless of their heritage, and also doing that on some dog samples, which is really problematic and just something to be aware of. And the next slide also has a link to a story about some of the limitations of these tests as well. So these are just to give you some places to start for further reading if you haven't looked at this before. And then I wanted just to show you a couple of other types of testing that haven't had as much attention in the academic literature or in the press, but which we actually do need more attention to be focused on. So this is one example. Who's the Daddy? It's a good name for a company, right? But you'll see on the next slide that they offer a home paternity test. More than 90% of the companies I've looked at that offer specific paternity tests do offer a home or peace of mind informal DNA test for paternity that doesn't involve witnesses. And then they also may offer a legal or court-approved test. So that's quite concerning, because those cheaper tests, if you're someone who is in a vulnerable position, for instance, and doesn't have the resources to challenge an assertion like this, it could really contribute to some negative issues, particularly for women, but it's not a very helpful resource. And these are just a couple more examples just to show you that this is happening in Australia as well, specifically, and in New Zealand. And a number of companies have operations in lots of different countries as well. And then the example I wanted to end with, which we don't generally get enough attention focused around, is child talent. Now, this is very dubious. It's not generally recommended by clinical geneticists to test children for late adult onset health conditions. And the connection between genetics and particular abilities and traits is not necessarily very well understood. And so services like these are potentially preying on parents quite a lot. And I did just want to highlight them because I find them very concerning. So you'll see things like time management here and big savings. So basically, they purport to tell you whether your child has musical ability or high levels of emotional intelligence or a high IQ. And so the sort of rhetoric around this type of service is that if your child isn't going to be Mozart, why bother paying for music lessons? But it's not a very helpful way of thinking about our abilities. And I did just want to highlight that for you. And this is another example just of the same sort of test from Origin 3, which is quite a prominent company as well. And just to give you an example of the types of things they say they can tell you about your child. So I'm not going to get into this too much, but just being children's data in these systems, there's a real question about who has capacity to consent in this space. And I'm going to end my examples of the industry with this company, Soccer Genomics, which is a real company which focuses on the connection between your DNA and your ability to play soccer. And it resulted in some genuine scientific backlash, but it's a very good example of the types of services out there that you should be cautious about. And so just thinking about overall privacy issues in the space, I mentioned that we share our DNA. I've mentioned that it's a unique identifier, but there's also a lot of social networking functions on these sites that encourage people to share data quite widely. So that poses difficulties even for companies when they're trying to be responsible in terms of if someone does change their mind and they want their account deleted. Also, this is the real sort of impact of some of these connections. Some connections can be very positive, but this details George Joe's experience of giving their parents genetic tests as Christmas gifts, and then that connecting his father with an unknown son, and that ultimately leading to the demise of his parents' marriage. Yay, thank you for the bell. I think I have frozen though. I'm not sure if I... Can you still see me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. I will only need a few more minutes and then I'll take questions. So this is just to give you an example of the types of impacts on people, which are often just buried in an online contract. And so fitness monitors, such as smartwatches and fitness bands, which are part of the quantified self movement, do actually raise similar issues. And we're starting to see this data being used in a variety of contexts. And while mostly what I was concerned with when I wrote that chapter was the idea of smart fitness bands and watches, we now have smart rings as well, and a variety of fashion technology, which I'm not going to get into today, but which I hope to do more work on. There's a number of bras and t-shirts and other garments now that have heart rate monitors and other sensors. And so this really tremendously increases the potential to track people in a variety of contexts. So just encouraging you to think about the types of data that are collected by wearable tech. There's a lot of different types of data here that we might traditionally have thought about as potentially health data, or at least sensitive data. And so this is quite problematic. But it's also problematic the way the industry has been regulated to date. So this is a reference to the work of the Norwegian Consumer Council, which has done some really good work looking at terms and conditions and privacy policies in this space. And then there's a few other things that I just wanted to highlight, that both DNA testing companies and providers of wearable tech are generally relying on their contracts and privacy policies to govern their relationships with consumers. And the potential for secondary use in this space is very broad. Law enforcement wants access to this data. Medical research, the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and also other entities such as immigration authorities have started accessing this data. And if you want to look into some recent cases of wearables, Nicole's article is very good, and I referred to that in my chapter, but there's two more recent cases of Bartis and Biomet and the state of Wisconsin and Birch, which I would encourage you to have a look into, and Epic has a really good, helpful page about that. And I'm going to skip over this because, and I'm going to stop talking, but I will just skip through to the end of my slides. I'm sorry about that. I've given a few extra things so that you can delve into some of this information in your own time. And I'll just end with my recommendations. I'm sorry, I'm not as used to using Teams. I've done a lot of Zoom in the last 2 years, and Signal as well, but not so much Teams. So thank you very much.